tough question because my answer through my career has been the writing of science fiction. You tell the stories. You tell stories set in the future, and then people get interested, and then they think about, well, what could we do now that would get us to that future if it's a good one? So writing utopian science fiction has been my answer, but I have to say, looking out at the world, it isn't as if it has been remarkably successful. I could say maybe it's been a little bit successful in giving people ideas, and then they pass these ideas along, and it shapes their actions in the present. But to up the gain on that and get better traction in the culture of these various metaphors that we use for being better heard and being more effective in changing people's behaviors, I don't know what you can do beyond stories. And well, there's political action, and that ranges from everything from voting to revolution. And I'm not an advocate of revolution because of the incredible damage and the backlashes that tend to come out of violent revolution. But we talk about revolution when we talk about the scientific revolution or the industrial revolution. And so a revolving or a turning to a new way. I think maybe what's happening is that as these many generations come along, you see the personal tolerance in the young people now that didn't exist in the older people, more xenophobic and racist. And now we have a more tolerant youth. That maybe change is happening and even at speed, but we are used to seeing what we see, believing what we believe, and so we only take in a certain amount of reality. And it always tends to look the same, but transformative things are kind of happening around us. So I guess what I'm saying is my own role is to keep on telling stories, and that I think that we all have to do political action, and we all have to think of our lives as political expressions, as that we're all citizens in a global. It is true that we are in a global village now, that it's all interdependent, and there is nobody that's apart from everybody else. So in that new consciousness of a world culture, well, things could happen pretty fast. It could be that through the course of this century, even though the semi-magical stuff that gets talked about at conferences like this one are not as interesting to me as the quite profound changes that might happen politically if we get more justice and more education, more adequacy, so that the bottom 2 billion people aren't living on $2 a day. And also the bulk of the population isn't living in fear that they too will drop into that state. They used to talk about the proletariat, and I heard a really neat term recently, the precariat, the people who feel that they're in a precarious position. Well, that could be maybe more than 6 billion of the 7 billion people on the planet feel their position is precarious, their well-being. And so in that situation, it may be that we'll have shifts towards more secure social systems. Well, it's just that you want to be more than reactive, so that strategic foresight would be like driving at night. You keep your headlights on rather than turning them off, so that you have a chance to look ahead a ways and react to the oncoming landscape. So it just makes perfect sense that we'd think a little bit about the future and say, this could happen and therefore let's try for it, or this could happen and therefore let's try to avoid it. So in a way, human behavior in the landscape, for the lifetime of the species, has had an element of futurity in it, particularly since for a long time we lived in certain areas of the world where you had to store food to get through the winter and spring. So there was at least an annual basis of, okay, we have to plan for this winter and spring where there isn't going to be the same food sources to get through to the summer and fall where there are going to be the food sources. So it's just part of human nature. Let's try to plan for the future. This is sort of the growth of a global consciousness, that since we're in a global culture and we can degrade the whole planet, which is new. And in the Victorian times, like Thomas Huxley once remarked, you could never fish all the fish out of the sea. And he was thinking of Victorian numbers and Victorian technology, and in that sense he was right. So now we can do things on a global scale we've never been able to do before. And we don't have the political mechanisms in the nation-state system to be able to deal with global problems, because effectively each nation-state can be pitted against each other by forces that don't care about these same issues. And in the fight between nation-states, global decisions don't get made. Right now we're having a UN environmental meeting in Qatar, and it's not going anywhere because we don't have global mechanisms that are strong enough. There is no sheriff as a name for that problem. So these are serious problems that need to be dealt with. And once again, you have to tell the story and point out, and this is where science comes in, because a lot of these things you can't see with your own senses. You can't sense them with your body. The damage to the planet is being done below the human sensory level, but it can be detected scientifically, and it can be explained such that we can see the danger. So once again, strategic planning becomes part of science, really. Well, I think that you can pretend that it's like weather, and you can begin to do scenario modeling. You can begin to put out like cones of probability where things that are quite probable in the very near future become less and less probable as you move outward into further future. And you can begin to take lessons out of climate modeling. If you agree that in the end we're physical systems, you can begin to think that the same kind of probabilistic behaviors will manifest. And you can, in other words, you can try to build algorithms to do historical prediction. And Cliodynamics is the name of this new field where they're working on these kinds of issues. So I guess it has to be treated like a scientific problem that we as a civilization have to solve. And then it's crucial that we be a scientific civilization. Because if you do, I mean, David Brin talks about this quite often, the people who are into renunciation or nostalgia or denial of reality, some kind of essentially denialist culture of the realities, then they can harm the effort to adjust to reality.